The CNN studio lights blazed hot as Karoline Leavitt, Trump's 27-year-old press secretary, sat across from Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in what was supposed to be a routine political discussion. The two women couldn't have looked more different. Leavitt in her sharp navy blazer, blonde hair perfectly styled, exuding the confidence of someone who had never lost a televised debate. Crockett, meanwhile, sat quietly in a burgundy suit, her legal pad filled with notes, her demeanor calm and professional. But when Leavitt smugly told the Texas Democrat to go back to law school and learn how the Constitution actually works, she had no idea what was coming next. The condescending tone in her voice was unmistakable, the kind of dismissive attitude that had made her famous among Trump supporters and infamous among Democrats. What happened in the following 30 seconds would become the most viral political moment of the year. Crockett didn't just fire back with words, she pulled out something that left Leavitt completely speechless, and may have just ended her reputation as the sharp-tongued voice of the Trump administration. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss how this political bombshell explodes across social media. The studio fell dead silent. Anderson Cooper, who had moderated hundreds of heated political debates, later said he'd never seen anything quite like what was about to unfold. This wasn't just another partisan argument. This was the moment when assumptions collided with reality, and one politician's arrogance met its perfect match. Leavitt, known for her quick comebacks and fierce loyalty to Trump, thought she was dealing with just another progressive politician she could easily outmaneuver. She had prepared her usual talking points about Democratic incompetence and constitutional ignorance. What she hadn't prepared for was facing someone who had credentials that would make her own resume look like a high school project. The tension in that CNN studio was about to explode into the kind of political theater that defines careers and destroys reputation. And it all started with one condescending comment that Leavitt would regret for the rest of her life. At just 27 years old, Karoline Leavitt had become the youngest White House press secretary in American history. Her rise through Trump's inner circle had been meteoric, from campaign volunteer to congressional candidate, to the most visible spokesperson for the administration. She was known for her sharp tongue, her ability to deflect difficult questions, and her unwavering loyalty to Trump's agenda. Leavitt came from a working-class New Hampshire family and had graduated from St. Anselm College, a small Catholic institution. She had cut her teeth in politics working for various Republican campaigns and had earned her reputation as a fierce defender of conservative values. Her press briefings were must-watch television, not because of groundbreaking policy announcements, but because of her combative style with reporters. She had appeared on CNN dozens of times, always ready with a quick comeback and a defense of Trump's latest controversy. Her media training had taught her to stay on message, attack the credibility of her opponents, and never back down from a fight. She walked into that studio that day with the confidence of someone who had never met a Democrat she couldn't out-debate. But Leavitt had a weakness, her tendency to underestimate her opponents, especially when they were women of color. She had a pattern of making assumptions about people's qualifications based on their appearance or their political affiliation. It was a blind spot that had served her well in friendly Fox News interviews, but was about to become her downfall on neutral ground. At 43, she was a rising star in the Democratic Party, known for her sharp legal mind and her ability to cut through political rhetoric with facts and logic. But unlike many politicians who wore their credentials on their sleeves, Crockett had a quiet confidence that often led opponents to underestimate her. What most people didn't know, and what Leavitt certainly didn't know, was that Jasmine Crockett was a Harvard Law School graduate. Not just any Harvard Law graduate, but one who had graduated magna cum laude and had been an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Before entering politics, she had been a successful civil rights attorney, taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch, and winning them with a combination of legal brilliance and courtroom charisma. Crockett had grown up in St. Louis, Missouri, the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. She had earned a full scholarship to Rhodes College in Memphis, where she graduated summa cum laude before heading to Harvard. Her path to Congress had been anything but typical. She had served in the Texas state legislature before winning her House seat in a competitive primary against several well-funded opponents. In Congress, Crockett had quickly established herself as a formidable presence on the House Judiciary Committee. She had grilled Republican witnesses with surgical precision, often revealing contradictions and inconsistencies that made headlines. Her colleagues respected her legal acumen, but she had managed to fly under the national radar, until now. The show Anderson Cooper 360 had booked both women to provide opposing perspectives on recent developments in immigration policy. It was the kind of standard cable news booking that happens dozens of times every week. A Trump spokesperson versus a Democratic critic, with Cooper playing referee. But tensions were already high before the cameras started rolling. The Trump administration was facing criticism over its handling of several major issues, and Leavitt had been tasked with defending policies that even some Republicans found troubling. She came into the studio ready for a fight, loaded with talking points, and prepared to go on the offensive. For Crockett, this was an opportunity to challenge the administration's narrative on national television. She had done her homework, studying the legal implications of the policies they would be discussing. She came prepared with facts, figures, and constitutional arguments that she hoped would cut through the administration's spin. Neither woman knew that they were about to create a moment that would define both of their careers. The stage was set for a collision between overconfidence and quiet competence, between assumption and reality, between political theater and legal expertise. The stakes couldn't have been higher. For Leavitt, this was a chance to demonstrate her value to the Trump administration and cement her reputation as an effective spokesperson. For Crockett, it was an opportunity to elevate her national profile and challenge the administration's narrative. Neither could have predicted that one condescending comment would change everything. Anderson Cooper opened the segment with his typical professional demeanor, introducing both guests and laying out the topic of discussion, the Trump administration's latest immigration enforcement measure. The conversation started routinely enough, with Leavitt defending the administration's policies as necessary for national security and border protection. These policies are about enforcing the law, Leavitt said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had delivered these talking points hundreds of times before. We're simply ensuring that immigration happens through legal channels, as the Constitution requires. Crockett listened patiently, taking notes on a legal pad. When Cooper turned to her for a response, she began methodically dismantling Leavitt's arguments with constitutional law and legal precedent. She cited specific court cases, referenced constitutional amendments, and explained the legal framework that actually governed immigration policy. The Constitution doesn't actually say what Ms. Leavitt claims it says, Crockett began, her voice calm but firm. The Supreme Court has consistently held that due process rights extend to all persons within U.S. borders, not just citizens. In fact, in Zadvidas Vifidavis, the court specifically. Leavitt's expression began to change as Crockett continued her legal analysis. This wasn't the usual Democratic talking points she was used to debating. This was actual legal scholarship, complete with case citations and constitutional interpretation. She tried to interrupt several times, but Cooper maintained control of the discussion. Ms. Leavitt, let her finish her point. Cooper interjected when Leavitt attempted to cut off Crockett's explanation of the legal precedents. As Crockett continued, viewers at home began to notice the difference in preparation levels. Leavitt was armed with political sound bites. Crockett was armed with legal expertise. The contrast was becoming more apparent with each exchange. Furthermore, Crockett continued, the administration's interpretation of the Immigration and Nationality Act directly contradicts the legislative intent, as outlined in the congressional record from the drafters specifically included provisions to prevent exactly the kind of arbitrary enforcement we're seeing. Leavitt was starting to look uncomfortable. This level of detailed legal analysis wasn't something she had prepared for. Her media training had focused on staying on message and deflecting, not engaging in substantive legal debates with someone who clearly knew the law better than she did. Leavitt, can you address the specific constitutional issues that Congresswoman Crockett has raised? This was where Leavitt began to falter. Instead of engaging with the legal arguments, she fell back on political attack. Look, Anderson, this is exactly the kind of legal mumbo-jumbo that Democrats use to confuse the American people. The law is clear, we have borders, and we have to enforce them. Crockett smiled slightly, recognizing the deflection for what it was. It's not mumbo-jumbo when it's the actual law, Ms. Leavitt. These are real constitutional principles that real courts apply every day. The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Leavitt was clearly out of her depth in a legal discussion, but her training and instincts were telling her to go on the offensive, rather than admit she was overmatched. As the segment continued, Leavitt became increasingly frustrated with Crockett's methodical legal argument. Every time she tried to pivot to political talking points, Crockett would bring the discussion back to constitutional law and legal precedent. It was like watching a high school debater try to argue with a Supreme Court justice. "The point is," Leavitt said, her voice rising slightly, "we're talking about national security here. We can't let legal technicalities prevent us from protecting the American people." "They're not technicalities," Crockett replied, her voice remaining calm. "They're constitutional rights. The Fifth Amendment doesn't become a technicality just because it's inconvenient for your policy preferences." Cooper was starting to look like he was watching a mismatch. Leavitt's usual confident demeanor was cracking as she realized she was in a debate she wasn't equipped to win. Her responses were becoming shorter and more defensive, while Crockett's were becoming more detailed and more devastating. Sensing that she was losing control of the narrative, Leavitt decided to make a personal attack. It was a move born of frustration and desperation, the kind of tactical error that experienced debaters know to avoid. But Leavitt was no longer thinking tactically. She was thinking survival. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her voice taking on a condescending tone, "I appreciate that you're trying to sound smart with all these legal terms, but maybe you should focus on understanding what the Constitution actually says instead of twisting it to fit your political agenda." The studio fell silent for a moment, Cooper's eyebrows raised slightly, recognizing that the discussion had just taken a personal turn. Crockett's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, the kind of subtle change that experienced trial lawyers recognize as the moment when their opponent has just made a fatal error. Perhaps emboldened by what she thought was a successful attack, or perhaps simply unable to stop herself, she decided to go further. The words that came out of her mouth next would haunt her for the rest of her career. "Look, I get it, you're a politician, and politicians like to sound impressive. But when you're talking about constitutional law, maybe you should go back to law school and learn how the Constitution actually works before you try to lecture the rest of us." The silence that followed was deafening. Cooper looked stunned. The camera operators continued filming, but you could sense that everyone in the studio knew something significant had just happened. Leavitt sat back in her chair with a satisfied smirk, apparently believing she had just delivered a knockout blow. Crockett looked at her for a long moment, then reached into her briefcase. The sound of paper rustling was amplified in the silent studio. When she pulled her hand back out, she was holding a diploma. "Actually," Crockett said, her voice still perfectly calm, "I did go to law school, Harvard Law School, magna cum laude, Harvard Law Review." She held up the diploma for the camera to see. "How about you, Ms. Leavitt? Where did you study constitutional law?" The color drained from Leavitt's face. Cooper's mouth fell slightly open, and across America viewers watching at home began to realize they were witnessing something special. The complete and total destruction of a political career in real time. The CNN studio had never been quieter. Karoline Leavitt sat frozen in her chair, staring at the Harvard Law diploma that Jasmine Crockett was holding up for the cameras. The piece of paper seemed to glow under the studio lights, a physical manifestation of everything Leavitt had just assumed wasn't there. Cooper, veteran journalist that he was, recovered first. "Congresswoman Crockett, for our viewers who may not be familiar with your background, can you tell us about your legal education?" Crockett carefully placed the diploma back in her briefcase, her movements deliberate and confident. "Of course, Anderson. I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where I was also an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Before that, I graduated summa cum laude from Rhodes College, with a degree in political science." She paused, looking directly at Leavitt, who still hadn't found her voice. "I practiced civil rights law for over a decade before entering politics, handling complex constitutional cases at both the state and federal level. I've argued before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals multiple times, and I've taught constitutional law as an adjunct professor." The camera captured every detail of Leavitt's reaction, the way her confident smirk had completely disappeared, the way her hands were now gripping the arms of her chair, the way she seemed to be shrinking into herself with each word Crockett spoke. Crockett wasn't finished. Having established her credentials, she began to methodically dismantle not just Leavitt's arguments, but her credibility as a spokesperson for constitutional issues. "Now, Ms. Leavitt, since you suggested I don't understand the Constitution, perhaps you can tell our viewers about your legal education. Where did you study constitutional law? What cases have you worked on? What court opinions have you written or contributed to?" Leavitt opened her mouth, then closed it again. The questions hung in the air like accusations. Everyone watching knew the answers. Leavitt had no legal education, no constitutional law experience, no courtroom experience. She was a political operative who had been caught pretending to expertise she simply didn't possess. I have a degree in communications from St. Anselm College. Leavitt finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Communications, Crockett repeated. Not unkindly, but with devastating effect. That's wonderful. Communications is important. But when you're discussing constitutional law on national television, don't you think viewers deserve to hear from someone who actually studied constitutional law? What happened next was remarkable. Instead of simply savoring her victory, Crockett used the moment to actually educate viewers about the constitutional issues they had been discussing. It was a masterclass in how to turn personal vindication into public service. Let me explain why this matters, Crockett said, addressing the camera directly. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It doesn't say no citizen. It says no person. This isn't a matter of political opinion. It's a matter of constitutional text. She pulled out her phone and began reading from a Supreme Court opinion. In Zadvidas Davis, decided in 2001, the Supreme Court held that the Due Process Clause applies to all persons within the United States, including aliens, whether their presence here is lawful, unlawful, temporary, or permanent. Leavitt could only sit and listen as Crockett provided the kind of detailed constitutional analysis that should have been part of the original discussion. It was becoming clear to everyone watching that this wasn't just a difference of political opinion. This was a difference between someone who knew the law and someone who was making things up. Sensing an opportunity to make a larger point, Cooper asked Crockett about the broader implications of what had just happened. Her response was devastating in its simplicity and accuracy. This is exactly the problem we're facing in American politics right now, Crockett said. We have people in positions of authority making definitive statements about complex legal and constitutional issues when they have no training or expertise in those areas. It's not enough to have opinions. When you're speaking for the government, you need to have knowledge. She gestured toward Leavitt, who was still sitting in stunned silence. Ms. Leavitt is the White House press secretary. She speaks for the President of the United States on constitutional matters. But as we've just seen, she doesn't actually understand the Constitution she claims to be defending. The implications were staggering. If the White House press secretary didn't understand basic constitutional law, what did that say about the administration's approach to constitutional issues? If she could be so completely wrong about something as fundamental as due process rights, what else was she wrong about? The clip of Crockett pulling out her Harvard diploma was being shared thousands of times per minute. The hashtag Jan Harvard degree began trending immediately, followed quickly by Leavitt schooled in constitutional burnout. The contrast between the two women couldn't have been stark. Crockett, calm and professional, explaining complex legal concepts with ease. Leavitt, flustered and silent, clearly out of her depth. It was political theater at its most dramatic, the moment when preparation met overconfidence, and won decisively. Twitter users were particularly brutal. Imagine telling a Harvard law grad to go back to law school, wrote one user. This is what happens when you assume someone's qualifications based on how they look, wrote another. The memes were already starting to flow, with images of Crockett holding up her diploma becoming instant classics. To her credit, Leavitt eventually tried to recover from the devastating blow. About 10 minutes into the segment, she attempted to steer the conversation back to politics and away from constitutional law. Look, this is exactly what I mean, she said, trying to regain some composure. Democrats want to turn everything into an academic exercise instead of focusing on real-world results. The American people don't care about Harvard degrees. They care about results. It was a reasonable attempt at recovery, but it fell flat in the context of what had just happened. Crockett's response was swift and devastating. The American people should care about whether their government officials understand the Constitution, she replied. These aren't academic exercises. These are real rights that affect real people. When the government violates someone's constitutional rights because its officials don't understand the Constitution, that's not an academic problem. That's a real-world crisis. It was a fair question, giving Leavitt one last chance to engage substantively with the legal issues. Leavitt's response revealed the complete extent of her predicament. I think we should let the American people decide what the Constitution means, not Harvard lawyers. The silence that followed was profound. Even Cooper seemed stunned by the response. The idea that constitutional interpretation should be left to popular vote rather than legal expertise was so fundamentally misguided that it revealed not just ignorance of the law, but ignorance of how the American legal system works. Crockett didn't even need to respond. She simply looked at the camera with an expression that said everything. This is why expertise matters. This is why education matters. This is why you can't fake your way through serious discussions about serious issues. The segment ended with Leavitt effectively silent and Crockett having delivered one of the most comprehensive demolitions of a political opponent in recent memory. It wasn't just that she had won the argument. She had exposed fundamental flaws in how the Trump administration approached constitutional issues, and had done so with such devastating effectiveness that recovery seemed impossible. As the cameras stopped rolling, the full impact of what had just happened was only beginning to be understood. Leavitt had walked into that studio as one of the most prominent young voices in Republican politics. She was leaving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of actual expertise in political discourse. The clip of Jasmine Crockett pulling out her Harvard Law diploma had already been viewed over 100,000 times on Twitter, and the numbers were climbing exponentially. The hashtag #JanHarvardDiploma was trending nationwide, alongside Leavitt schooled and Joe back to law school. The memes came fast and furious. One showed Crockett holding up her diploma with the caption, "Receipts." Another featured a split screen of Leavitt's confident face before the diploma reveal and her shocked expression after, titled "Before and After Reality." A particularly popular one showed the Harvard logo with the text, "When someone tells you to go back to law school, but you already graduated magna cum laude." The video clips were everywhere. TikTok users created compilation videos showing the exact moment Leavitt's confidence crumbled. Instagram accounts dedicated to political moments shared side-by-side photos of the two women, Leavitt looking smug, Crockett looking triumphant. Facebook groups exploded with discussions about credentials, expertise, and the Dunning-Kruger effect in politics. TV investigations scrambled to cover what was quickly being called the Harvard moment. CNN itself led with the story on every subsequent program, with Anderson Cooper himself calling it one of the most stunning reversals I've witnessed in over 2 decades of journalism. MSNBC ran a special segment titled "When Assumption Meets Reality," featuring legal experts discussing the broader implications of having government officials who don't understand the Constitution making statements about constitutional law. Rachel Maddow dedicated an entire segment to walking through Crockett's legal credentials and comparing them to other government officials. Fox News found itself in a difficult position. Leavitt was a frequent guest and a Trump administration official, but the moment was so devastating that even friendly hosts struggled to spin it positively. Several Fox personalities simply avoided discussing it altogether, while others tried to frame it as an example of Democratic elitism, a strategy that backfired when viewers pointed out that Crockett had grown up in a working-class family and earned her way to Harvard through merit. The implications for the Trump administration were immediate and severe. If their press secretary, the person charged with explaining and defending administration policies, didn't understand basic constitutional law, what did that say about the administration's approach to governance? Democrats seized on the moment. Nancy Pelosi tweeted, "This is what happens when expertise meets incompetence. The American people deserve better." Chuck Schumer released a statement saying, "Today's exchange perfectly illustrates why elections have consequences. Competence matters. Knowledge matters. The Constitution matters." Republican responses were notably muted. Several GOP senators who were asked about the exchange declined to comment or offered tepid support for Leavitt, that focused on her loyalty rather than her competence. The silence spoke volumes about how indefensible the moment was, even for partisan supporters. And Harvard Law School itself became an unexpected beneficiary of the viral moment. Applications inquiries spiked by 300% in the 48 hours following the segment. The school's official Twitter account, which rarely comments on political matters, shared a simple tweet, "We're proud of our graduates who use their education to serve the public good." Legal scholars across the country weighed in on the exchange. Constitutional law professors used it as a teaching moment, assigning students to watch the clip and analyze the legal arguments presented. Several wrote op-eds about the importance of legal expertise in government and the dangers of having officials who don't understand the documents they've sworn to uphold. The American Bar Association issued a rare statement emphasizing the importance of legal training for government officials who make pronouncements about constitutional law. Bar associations in multiple states held emergency webinars on constitutional literacy in government, with many featuring Crockett as a guest speaker. Her next scheduled press briefing was moved to a smaller room, and several reporters' questions focused entirely on her constitutional knowledge. Video of the CNN exchange played on every major network before she spoke, creating an atmosphere where every statement she made about legal or constitutional issues was scrutinized for accuracy. White House sources, speaking anonymously, reported that senior administration officials were concerned about Leavitt's effectiveness following the exchange. Several suggested that she might need additional legal training or that legal experts should be present at future briefings when constitutional issues might arise. The social media mockery was relentless. Every time Leavitt appeared on television, viewers flooded social media with references to the Harvard diploma moment. "Maybe someone should ask her about constitutional law" became a common refrain. Her Wikipedia page was edited dozens of times to include references to the exchange, and "Go back to law school" became a meme associated with her name. Conservative media figures who had previously championed Leavitt found themselves distancing from her. Several Fox News hosts who had regularly featured her as a guest quietly stopped booking her for segments involving legal or constitutional issues. Her Twitter following increased by over 200,000 in the first week after the segment aired. Speaking requests poured in from universities, legal organizations, and political groups across the country. Democratic leadership took notice. Crockett was added to high-profile committee assignments and invited to participate in major policy discussions. Her legal expertise, which had been somewhat overlooked in the rough-and-tumble world of politics, was suddenly seen as a valuable asset for the party. Book publishers reached out about potential memoir deals. Television producers discussed documentary projects. Crockett's Harvard law classmates organized viewing parties for the clip, with many sharing their own stories about their former classmates' brilliance in law school. Most importantly, Crockett used her newfound platform responsibly. She appeared on multiple news programs to discuss constitutional law, always focusing on educating viewers rather than simply savoring her victory. Her measured, knowledgeable responses stood in stark contrast to the bombastic style that had become common in political discourse. Op-ed writers across the political spectrum used the moment to discuss the broader problem of officials making authoritative statements about subjects they don't understand. The Harvard moment, as it came to be known, became a case study in business schools, communication programs, and political science courses. Students analyzed how assumptions about expertise can backfire spectacularly when they encounter actual expertise. The moment also highlighted issues of representation and bias. Many commentators noted that Leavitt's assumption that Crockett wasn't legally trained likely stemmed from unconscious biases about race and gender. The exchange became a teachable moment about the dangers of judging people's qualifications based on their appearance or background. The exchange had lasting effects on American political discourse. "Show your receipts" became a common demand when political figures made claims about their expertise or qualifications. The phrase "Harvard diploma moment" entered the political lexicon as shorthand for times when assumed expertise meets actual expertise. Congressional hearings began featuring more rigorous questioning of witnesses' qualifications. Senators and representatives started doing more thorough research on the backgrounds of people testifying before their committees, leading to more substantive questioning and fewer embarrassing moments. The Trump administration quietly began including more legal experts in policy discussions and press preparations. While they never publicly acknowledged that the Leavitt-Crockett exchange had influenced this decision, the timing was telling. The exchange revolutionized political media training. Consultants began emphasizing the importance of actually understanding the subjects their clients would be discussing, rather than simply memorizing talking points. Several training programs were developed specifically to help political figures avoid Harvard diploma moments. Opposition research became more sophisticated, with teams specifically looking for gaps between officials' claimed expertise and their actual qualifications. The exchange proved that these gaps could become major vulnerabilities when exposed by knowledgeable opponents. Millions of Americans who had never thought seriously about constitutional law found themselves learning about due process rights, Supreme Court precedents, and the structure of legal arguments. Constitutional law professors reported increased enrollment in their courses, with many students specifically citing the CNN exchange as their inspiration. High school civics teachers began using the clip as a teaching tool, showing students the importance of understanding the Constitution and the value of legal education. The moment became a powerful argument for civic education and constitutional literacy. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange established a new standard for political discourse. The days when officials could make vague, unsupported claims about constitutional law without challenge were over. The Harvard diploma moment had shown that expertise matters, that credentials can be verified, and that overconfidence without knowledge is a recipe for public humiliation. Political figures across the spectrum began taking more care with their claims about expertise. The exchange served as a warning. In an age of instant fact-checking and viral videos, you can't fake expertise for long. Foreign media outlets covered the story as an example of American political discourse, with many noting the stark contrast between Crockett's expertise and Leavitt's assumption. Several international commentators used the moment to discuss the importance of having qualified officials in government positions. Diplomatic circles buzzed with discussions about American political competence. Foreign officials who had to work with the Trump administration began asking more pointed questions about the qualifications of their American counterpart. Years later, the Leavitt-Crockett exchange would still be studied in political science courses as a perfect example of how political careers can be made or destroyed in a single moment. It demonstrated the power of preparation, the importance of expertise, and the dangers of making assumptions about your opponents. For Jasmine Crockett, the moment launched her into the top tier of Democratic political figures. Her combination of legal expertise and political acumen made her a sought-after voice on constitutional issues and a potential candidate for higher office. For Karoline Leavitt, the exchange served as a career-defining moment that highlighted the gap between political ambition and actual competence. While she continued in her role, she never fully recovered the authority and credibility she had possessed before encountering Crockett's Harvard diploma. The exchange ultimately became more than just a viral moment. It became a symbol of why expertise matters in governance and why the American people deserve officials who actually understand the Constitution they've sworn to uphold. The lesson was clear. In politics, as in law, it's not enough to sound confident. You have to actually know what you're talking about. And when you don't, sometimes reality comes in the form of a Harvard law diploma that changes everything. If you enjoyed watching this incredible political showdown unfold, make sure to subscribe for more breaking political moments, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when these kinds of explosive confrontations happen. What do you think? Was this the most devastating political moment of the year? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that expertise and preparation always win in the end.